Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we will be talking about my updated election prediction. We are now only 19 days away from the 2024 election, which is really insane to think. This election has really sped up, it seems like, ever since Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee, and we are already right near the election, so these predictions will be coming much more frequently. I just did one a few days ago, so this is now my updated election prediction for October 17th, 19 days before Election Day. So, of course, we will start with our safe Democratic states. These are the states where we know they are going to Kamala Harris for sure. Typically, this means a 15% margin or higher for each respective party. So, these are the Californias, the Hawaiis, the Washingtons of the world. Oregon would be a safe state as well. You can see I do have my forecast here. So, of course, it ranges from the 86% margin, like in DC for Kamala Harris, all the way down to the exactly 15% margin for Kamala Harris in a state like Oregon. So, again, this is a wide array of states that you never hear about in presidential elections, just because, again, they are safe. They are solid for each party. We know how they are going to vote. Now, these are all the safe states for Kamala Harris. As for Donald Trump, he also has quite a few. It surmounts to less electoral votes, but he does make that up elsewhere in the likely states. But across the Midwest, of course, he sweeps by high margins. Kansas becomes safe. That was likely in 2020. And those are all the safe states for Trump. So as you can see, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, after safe states, they're at 181 electoral votes. Trump and Vance are at 113. As for likely states are states that are decided by a 5 to 15% margin, so a bit closer. These are again, these were states that were looking competitive when Joe Biden was the nominee in 2024. States that were pretty Democratic in 2020. This is the 2020 election map. Like Virginia, that went to Biden by 10. Like Minnesota, +7. Like New Mexico, +11. They were really healthy margins in 2020. But when Biden was the candidate, was the nominee of the Democratic Party, very weak candidate. Some of these looked like pure toss-ups. But what Kamala Harris has been able to do is really get this Democratic Party to unite and rally around her. She has, when you look at voter enthusiasm, those numbers in polls, it absolutely skyrocketed for the Democratic Party ever since Kamala Harris became a candidate for president. So that means states like Colorado, New Mexico, Minnesota, Virginia, New Hampshire, and Maine, states that we were talking about a lot not too long ago with Biden as the candidate. These are states that Harris is looking very good in. As you can see, when it comes to my official forecast with all the margins, as you can see, these likely Democratic states, those are the ones. And again, it's not too bad for Kamala Harris at all. Very little trend towards the Republicans, if at all. You can see that, Maine stays exactly stagnant. Minnesota actually becomes more Democratic with Tim Walz as the VP candidate. Nebraska's 2nd district, a growing Democratic district. I forgot to add it here. But Nebraska's 2nd also would be likely Democrat. And they are very, very, very healthy margins. The lowest is +7 in New Hampshire and the 2nd district of Nebraska, and the highest goes all the way up to almost a 10-point victory in Virginia. And when you look at the shift from 2020, the column to the right of the actual margin, which is what you see here, is the shift from 2020. And again, not good for Donald Trump. He's only, in Virginia, it's only becoming 0.6% more Republican. New Mexico, 1.3% more Republican. Not nearly enough if you're trying to flip a whole electoral map that you lost in 2020, as of course he did in 2020. So these are states that we do not really need to talk about. As I made a video about specifically these states, they are just simply these once battleground states that are now drifting more and more away from Donald Trump. So all of those states that I outlined there, they would go to Kamala Harris and Tim Walz by a likely margin. Good batch of electoral votes there. Now, as for Donald Trump and JD Vance, they have quite a few likely states, of course. First and foremost, these very Republican ones that we don't need to talk about at all: South Carolina, Alaska, Maine 2nd congressional district, right? Almost safe states, but not quite at that 15% margin just yet. They do remain likely margin states, but again, not competitive at all. And then we have two states, Iowa and Ohio. These ones are a bit interesting, especially Iowa, because the literal most accurate pollster in the nation, Ann Selzer, actually released a poll. Not, it was, yeah, it is, kind of long ago, and they release these polls very infrequently. But it was great news for Kamala Harris. Again, this is the most accurate pollster in the nation. They get it spot on literally every time, and it showed Trump with just a 4-point lead in Iowa. That was a real shock to the system there. So we really need another poll to see how this race has changed, if Trump has expanded his lead, whoops, or if it has stayed the same. So that will be very interesting to see. But again, I mean, if you're going to trust a poll, if you're going to look at one poll and say, yes, this will be the margin as of right now, it's going to be Selzer and Company's poll in Iowa. However, I do think that since this poll, Trump has been able to gain a few points nationwide. That has been apparent in most things. Again, early September is a long time ago. So a state like Iowa, I would be more comfortable not making it a lean margin as this 4-point margin is, but rather a likely margin, just as it was in 2020 with Trump's 8.2% victory. So there you could just see how shocking this poll was, to be the most accurate in the nation, showing Trump losing 4 points in a very rural state that no one was really expecting to be on the radar. But if Kamala Harris does win by quite a lot, by quite a landslide, you're going to thank this poll, right? Or not thank, but you're going to look at this poll and say, this was the indicator. We should have trusted Selzer and Company because they predicted it from the beginning. And then alongside Iowa is Ohio. Polls aren't really indicating a close race there, so it's not really one that we are talking about all too much. And then there is one more, and it's extremely important because it is no longer a battleground state on the presidential level for the first time in literally decades, and that is Florida. Florida, I do think, will be a likely margin state. When you look back in history, this is not normal for Florida. In 2020, they voted for Trump by 3.4%, very close lean margin. 2016, it was even closer. Barack Obama won it by an excruciatingly close 0.8% in 2012. 2008, it was a lean margin. The last time it was even over 5%, it was still 5% margin. It wasn't even over 5% margin. The last time it was actually over 5% margin was in 1996. So literally decades since Florida hasn't been an extremely close state in presidential elections. However, Florida, I mean, 2016 to 2020 tells most, but 2022 tells all. In 2016, Trump won the state by 1.2%. And when you look at the trend map from 2016 to 2020, as you can see, the vast majority of the nation became more Democratic, right? This is from 2016 to 2020, which states became more Republican versus more Democratic. But one of the only states to trend towards the Republicans at all, and it was by the most, it was Florida. Florida became 2 points more Republican. That was extremely important considering that Democrats, put a huge stake of their campaign in Florida. Despite that heavy campaigning, it became more Republican in 2020, despite the nation as a whole becoming much more Democratic. And then, of course, you head over to 2022, where Ron DeSantis won re-election as governor by 19%, way more than any polls were projecting. There is no reason, especially considering that the polling does show Donald Trump with a pretty hefty lead, around 5%, 5 or 6% right now. There is no reason to think that Florida will be close at all, considering how fast it is becoming more Republican. So after likely states, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz retain a pretty strong lead at 226 electoral votes. Trump and Vance at 179. 270 are needed to win the presidency. Now we will move on to lean states. These are states that are decided by a 1 to 5% margin. So these are the close ones, right? We'll get to tilt states in a second, which are basically pure toss-ups. But lean states are extremely close as well. They could really go either way come election day. I am not, as certain on these as we are for some of these likely states. So starting with the Democrats, they have quite a few very important ones, notably Michigan. Michigan was a state that did go to Joe Biden in 2020, and by 2.8%. 2.8% is not nothing. It's not like, basically a 50-50 margin, like how Biden won Georgia, right? Just about 50-50. You can't call a race that close. But Michigan, it's more than a 50-50 margin, right? That is actually substantial, a almost 3% margin in Michigan. And I say that, and I bring up the gubernatorial result in 2022, where Gretchen Whitmer, won re-election by 11 points when you round. So the point I'm trying to make is that what goes for a lot of these states is that they lean Democratic time and time again, election after election. It is proven that there are simply more Democratic voters who tend to turn out in these elections than there are Republican voters. Now, yes, Whitmer was a strong candidate. Yes, I guess Joe Biden was a relatively strong candidate compared to now in 2020. But what Kamala Harris has been able to show is that she is that sort of generic Democrat that they ask voters if they'd vote for in polls. Voters, or she is staking her campaign, right, as a moderate, and she's just staking her campaign really in the fact that she is not Donald Trump, and she is basically a return to normalcy, like the kind of campaign that Joe Biden ran in 2020, in a very similar way. That's what it is. So, considering that Trump is a weaker candidate than he has ever been, people say that 2016 in Michigan, it was really a fluke, and I understand why they would say that. It was, of course, the closest state in the 2016 election. And Michigan, maybe Wisconsin, maybe Pennsylvania, but Michigan really wasn't on anyone's radar. Just 8 years ago, they had voted for Barack Obama by 17 points in the 2008 election. So, considering that Donald Trump was at his very peak, I believe, as a candidate in 2016, and he only won by zero point 0.2, there's not enough slack here for Donald Trump to win the election. That is really the fundamental thing here. I mean, I don't believe that Donald Trump can possibly, when you just look at the facts of him as a candidate and his favorability ratings in January 6th and everything, and the overturning of Roe, especially, I don't find it possible, and this goes for all the states. I don't find it possible that Trump can be as strong of a candidate in 2024 as he was in 2022. So to have someone, and the only reason he was going to beat Joe Biden was because Joe Biden was a historically strange candidate when it comes to his age and just his competency in that sort of physical situation. But against someone as regular, as generic, as normal as Kamala Harris, I don't think that he will win the election. Michigan goes to Kamala Harris. Pennsylvania goes to Kamala Harris. Nevada goes to Kamala Harris. Pennsylvania voted for Biden by 1.2% in the last election. And yeah, I mean, the suburbs are really quickly turning away from Donald Trump. You can just see from 2016 to 2020, Chester County, Pennsylvania, voted for Hillary by 9.5%, voted for Biden 4 years later by 17.1. So that's a 7.6% trend toward the left in just 4 years. So you can imagine how much more Democratic some of these suburban counties will become after the overturning of Roe, after January 6th, after just Trump, Trump's reaction, right, to losing the 2020 election, which of course Americans vastly disapprove of. So these very family-oriented voters in a state like Pennsylvania, in the suburbs, that is, they are going to turn their backs on Donald Trump. And then, of course, Nevada. That looks like Harris's best state out of the 7 core battleground states. That one also will go to Kamala Harris, and I'm pretty confident on that. Now, we have just a few states remaining. We're going to go to Donald Trump's lean states right now. So absolutely Texas. And Texas, I do think, will vote to the left of Florida, which is definitely odd and something you don't see often. I don't even know the last time that it happened. This tracker here only goes until 1960, and yeah, and it the last time that Texas voted for the left of Florida, it actually is whatever. We actually can see it on this tracker. Is what I'm trying to say. And it happened in 1988, but whatever. So it just goes to show how that is an interesting development. Florida, more Republican than Texas, but you all know Texas is a very leftward trending state right now, and this is the only lean Republican state that I do think Trump will win. And as you can see, it is becoming more Democratic in my forecast, 0.9% more Democratic from 2020 when Donald Trump won it by 5.6%. Harris isn't the strongest candidate in the world, but I do think that she has enough to win over enough Latino voters, enough suburban voters, most especially around Dallas County, to be able to make Texas even more Democratic, definitely setting up a potential Democratic win here for future elections. So now we just have 4 states remaining, all four of which I believe will be decided by a tilt margin. So starting with Kamala Harris, actually we'll start with Donald Trump since he's behind. Harris and Walz are at 266, Trump and fans are at 219, and Harris and Walz only need 4 more electoral votes to reach 270 and win, so that means that they just need a single one of these states to win the election. Let's see if they are able to do it. Now, as for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, they win Georgia and they win North Carolina. I really believe in the end, when it comes to the polling, I think that they are, pretty much getting it right in terms of how minorities will turn out for Kamala Harris. But they're really underestimating white suburban voters, especially white suburban women. So where is that going to matter? Primarily the Rust Belt, right? Pennsylvania especially, but Michigan and Wisconsin too, as well as Arizona, Maricopa County. Tons of white suburban, suburban moms, basically white suburban moms. That is the voter demographic that will win Kamala Harris the election. So when it comes to North Carolina and Georgia, I really don't think that Kamala Harris will be as underestimated as she will be in some of these other states in the polls. And whatever, I just don't see a clear path to victory for Kamala Harris here. As I mean, Georgia, you can see voted for Biden by 0.2%. It just isn't enough slack. Maybe if Biden won it by 2 in 2020, or if Hillary won it in 2016, maybe that'd be enough slack, but it was just about dead even in 2020. And I think that Harris really is just going to suffer more losses than gains in a state like Georgia, with all things considered. North Carolina, however, I don't. It is a leftward trending state as Georgia is, but Mark Robinson is on the ballot. That is a dynamic that is not being reflected in the polling at all. I mean, it would be impossible to reflect in the polling. So we'll see how that plays out. Of course, Mark Robinson, GOP candidate for governor, closely associated with Donald Trump. The Harris campaign is literally running ads where whatever Trump calls Robinson MLK and steroids. That barely matters, but Trump did win it by a point and a third in 2020, so that is why I do still have it as lean Republican. Now, Wisconsin shouldn't surprise you all too much considering the other blue wall states. They once again vote together, continuing that historical trend. I don't see this election being a random election where the blue wall suddenly doesn't vote together. The last time that happened, I believe, was in 2004. But Wisconsin votes for Kamala Harris by a very narrow tilt margin. I have Wisconsin as a tilt, of course, Democrat margin. But look at that, just a 0.2% margin in Wisconsin. But again, this is another one. Leans Democratic, right? The governor won re-election, definitely closer than Michigan and Pennsylvania, but the governor won re-election by 3.4%. So that is why I do think that this will be definitely the narrowest of the blue wall states. And when you look at 2020, it was the closest Biden state of the blue wall. And in 2016, it was the highest margin for Trump in the blue wall. So obviously the most Republican of all these states. But when you've got a 2 point margin in Michigan, 1.5 margin in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin will go blue as well. Now we have one more state. And I'm about to drop a very, very, very hot take for you all right now. Arizona is currently the number one best state for Donald Trump of the 7 core battleground states, or it's just about tied with Georgia, actually. Arizona, Donald Trump is leading by 1.6%. Georgia, well, it doesn't matter really what Georgia is. But what is so it again, it's Donald Trump's basically tied for his best core battleground state, and it's actually one that I think Harris will win. I think for the first time, I think that this is actually the first time ever in the Harris versus Trump matchup that I'm giving Arizona to Harris. But we do really have to think about this abortion referendum on the ballot. That's really going under the radar for a lot of analysts, but that's something that's not reflected in polling at all. And Harris is running this very smart, I should say, campaign on courting Republican voters, and she's doing it in Pennsylvania, across the nation, sure, but she's really making this an emphasis in Arizona. And that if you're going to do it in one state, make it Arizona, because you've got a lot of John McCain Republicans, rooted in pretty conservative values, but these Republicans who don't like Donald Trump, of course, because of his rhetoric, because of January 6th and all that, that was key to Biden's coalition to winning Arizona in 2020. It was a huge shock to a lot of people, and it was because Trump wasn't able to unite this Republican base. Now, Kamala Harris is now running a stronger campaign when it comes to courting Republican voters than Biden did even in 2020. So, there's a lot of dynamics in Arizona. The border is absolutely an issue that will hurt Kamala Harris. So, that's something to keep in mind. It'll be interesting to see how, these usual issues that we see, like the economy, like immigration and the border, how all those traditional issues play against newer issues like the rhetoric in January 6th regarding Donald Trump, but especially being in a post-Roe era with a abortion referendum on the ballot. But I mean, this might change. Look, I have it D plus point one. It's literally toss up right now. I don't know. But I do have this really strong feeling that Harris will pick off Arizona and she wins the election. 287 to 251, a close election, way too close to confidently call, but I do have her in the favorite camp right now. So thank you all for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe. That helps a lot. And comment your thoughts on this prediction down below. Drop a like if you haven't already. And I'll see you all next time.